So yeah, I'll give a quick introduction to the session today on the deep dive on impact evaluation. The main purpose, as I saw it, was to explore how the 3D framework that I developed as part of my PhD on network leadership for transformative capacity can be used for impact assessment and evaluation in the context of the Weaving Lab. And we're focused mainly on the Weaving Lab and its core activities. It's also very applicable to the members of the Weaving Lab and the initiatives that are part of it, of course. And the idea is also that this is perhaps just the first call of a series and a journey to go deeper into this inquiry, and maybe have a series of calls with some body reflections in between, and we can reflect on that a bit later. And the process of the call is organized in 3 main steps. First, I'm going to share a little bit of input on some general understanding of impact assessment and evaluation. Why do we need it? For which purposes? When is which kind of approach appropriate? And then introduce the 3D framework, and yeah, just give you a bit of background there that we can then use for having a bit of an open discussion around clarifying any concepts, just brainstorming a bit what we see as useful or generative in the framework. And then I would like to, initially the idea was to have a breakout session. We could still do that with maybe 2 or 3 breakouts, but if we feel that it's more useful to just stay in the main room and just bounce off some ideas, I guess we could do that as well. And yeah, then we can end with basically the focus of the breakouts will be to explore how the 3D framework could be applied within the context of the Weaving Lab, and focusing on the main activities that are ongoing. And then we can harvest the main opportunities we see there, and reflect on what would be the next actions to take forwards. So is that fine with everybody? Any questions so far? Otherwise, I'll move on with sharing my screen. Second. All right. So basically, I came up with some basic ways of structuring this rather complex field of impact evaluation and assessment. And first of all, I'd like to just distinguish these 2 terms a little bit. How I've come to understand assessment is more about really understanding what actually happens. To what degree have we realized the impacts that we are aiming for? And evaluation is then more about how did it happen? What is the underlying causality? Which activities have led to those impacts? And how can we learn from those, from reflecting on that process? And how can we improve our effectiveness? And there's 2 main purposes of doing this sort of evaluation or assessments. One is more from the internal perspective of us as weavers, network leaders, and from the external perspective of funders or partners. So I just came up with some keywords here. Internally, assessment might be more about acquiring funding and motivating our members, that we see that we're actually achieving what we set out to do. And evaluation is more about learning, developing our strategies, improving our effectiveness, while from the external perspective, it's usually more about accountability to funders, and funders having a better idea of what programs to fund and what's effective and efficient in terms of resources, maybe even sharing lessons as a funder from one program to another. It's also about having a clear idea of which kind of impact are we talking about. So you might be familiar with this iceberg model, that there's different levels of depth in terms of what we want to change in society. So usually we talk about sort of the more visible events and underlying patterns, system structures, and at the deepest layer, the mental models that shape those structures and patterns. And we can talk about different kinds of change. So incremental change is more about improving performance within existing rules. Reformative change, revising some structures, maybe legal changes in incentives. But then the transformative piece is really about the underlying creating new unimagined possibilities, shaping your worldviews about what's possible. And that's usually the most difficult and most long-term change. So the deeper levels of change come with more complexity. And that there's also a sort of temporal dimension here. What do we want to focus on when? And I realized that there's a bit of an overlap here between different stages of impact. So you might be familiar with the sort of log frame or impact logic that talks about outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And I just focus here on outcomes and impacts because that's usually part of impact evaluation, though oftentimes the focus is just on activities and outputs. And then also in terms of network development, networks go through different stages, right, of launching, setting up ideas, setting goals, and then maturing and institutionalizing. And then activity levels might also be more complex, from specific interventions in a course or program with one target group, and then developing a portfolio of programs addressing different aspects of a system, and then having really collaborative ecosystems of multiple organizations and networks collaborating. And then, of course, complexity increases over time. So I guess that's just a good framework to keep in mind as we think of what to assess at which stage. I won't go too much in depth here, as we can have a discussion on this later if needed. I just wanted to mention that usually in conventional approaches, there's a focus on more quantitative, linear assessments, usually with an orientation to funding, and focus on incremental changes, more short-term, and focusing on particular initiatives, focusing on outputs like deliverables and so on. And it's less frequent that we see really quality work on qualitative assessments, have taken a more holistic approach, focusing on learning and developing the impact initiatives, and really with a focus on transformative long-term change and collaborative ecosystems, focusing on outcomes and impacts, because those are usually much more difficult to measure and require funding that is not limited to 2-year programs. So just a bit of background on this, and now I want to dive in a little bit on the 3D framework, which tries to tackle some of those gaps that I mentioned. So in my PhD work, building on a project called Transit, Transformative Social Innovation Theory, we looked at things like eco-villages, transition towns, time-based currencies, basic income, and so on. And looking at how these initiatives interact with dominant institutions, I kind of figured out that there's these 3 dimensions of institutions. So with formal institutions, you know, like bureaucracies, and for informal institutions like shared norms and values. And if we talk about neoliberalism, for instance, as a dominant institution, we can see that it's very widespread in terms of its having an influence all across the world in all kinds of cultural contexts. And it's very coherent across those contexts in terms of these underlying mechanisms or principles of private ownership and so on. And it's very deeply embedded in terms of structures, you know, like GDP and tax incentives, and culturally embedded in our underlying worldviews about what is a successful economy, what is the meaning of growth, and what is the place of the human in the natural context, what's the place of the economy. And it's very long, it's very persistent in terms of the temporal reproduction over time. So since the 1800s, 1900s, when the sort of neoliberal or the liberal mindset evolved, it's been very difficult to change, and it's been very persistent in incorporating any challenges or critiques. So if we want to change these kind of dominant institutions that are very widespread, deeply embedded, and persistent over time, we need to develop alternatives that create uproot and sort of lessen the depth, lessen the width, lessen the length of those dominant institutions, create alternatives that are equally or even more deeply embedded, widespread, and so on. So then we can look at these, can use those 3 dimensions for talking about impact. transformative impact specifically. So I'll just mention a couple of examples here. If we think of, for instance, basic income. Most people know this example, so that's why I'm using it now. It's not so widespread yet. There's a couple of experiments in different countries, but it's it's not very widespread in the sense of that it's already the norm in all kinds of cultural contexts and across organizations, and it's not very coherent. There's different ways of implementing it. It's not really a coherent idea of how can it be funded, what are the underlying principles. And in terms of depth, you could say that if basic income was the norm, that it would be recognized by established institutions, that it's a legitimate approach, that it's integrated into policies and all kinds of welfare delivery organizations, that there's incentive structures to make sure that this basic income is adopted by all kinds of organizations, and is also embedded in our values and norms, that people just generally believe that this is a basic human right, and that there's a change in power relationships. And the length piece would be about that it's not just implemented for an experiment or short term during an election cycle where one politician says, yes, let's do basic income, but across election cycles, there's a continuity of basic income persisting, even though there might be critiques, there might be corona, there might be all kinds of crises. And we're seeing now, for instance, with corona, that institutions like the welfare state or liberal democracy are being challenged with more kind of autocratic approaches, maybe coming more to the front. So then if we have these three dimensions of impact, and we can then look at how can we actually bring about impact. So this is the notion of transformative capacity, which is about the ability for turning transformative potential into transformative impact. So the idea is that basic income is maybe a great idea, and it's a really transformative idea with a lot of potential to really radically shift the welfare state, the underlying beliefs about people's fundamental rights. And if we would want to promote basic income, then there would need to be a transnational network like Basic Income Earth Network that promotes this principle, able to spread this principle across all kinds of different national contexts in the global north and the global south, engage a variety of people who have different beliefs about whether this is the right thing to do, collaborate across different movements, working on this and really building a coherence across different approaches, different experiments of how to implement this. And you need to be able to understand and really create a current understanding of what's actually wrong with the dominant welfare state, and how could basic income generate actual workable solutions, and how can we actually implement this. Be really clear about what are the underlying core principles, what really makes basic income different from other kinds of welfare support systems. You need to be able to strategically cooperate with dominant institutions, with politicians and private actors, while being reflexive about how these underlying principles might become less transformative by negotiating and coming to compromises and losing that kind of transformative aspect of it. And I've also come to understand that reconciliation and healing of trauma is oftentimes a very deep aspect of transformation that's not that often talked about, but yeah, that's a whole nother call in and of itself. And the lengthening capacities are things like generating continuity of resources, that there's not just short-term funding, but people who want to promote basic income have a continuity of funding their work, and projects not just dying out and the learning from one project then being limited to that time space, but also ensuring resilience in the face of challenges as people are critiquing it, maybe with valid arguments, coming up with rebuttals and really overcoming those challenges. Can be COVID and other crises like that in the context, but also evolving over time and not just always having the same strategies, the same arguments, experimenting and learning over time, and reorganizing the networks, becoming more decentralized as the network spreads more globally, and reorganizing and becoming more mature as a network, going through different stages. So I might, let me see, time is limited, so I'll just have a look. I'll just take 2 more minutes to wrap this up. So the next step here, if we have this understanding of transformative impact and capacity, is how can we actually build, how can we develop these capacities, and how can we bring about this impact as network leaders? So here's just, again, the main concept that I just talked about on the top 2 elements here, and the bottom part then is about how can network leaders support learning processes to develop this transformative capacity. And you can think of courses, online and offline events, consulting projects, communities of practice, research programs, training of trainers, tools that allow people to reflect on how effective they're working, and mapping all kinds of initiatives, having partnerships with all kinds of organizations across sectors, developing platforms like Mighty Networks, like all kinds of online tools, and really building an ecosystem of all these different learning spaces and support activities that collectively generate widening, deepening, and lengthening capacities. And at the same time, there's a sort of 2-directional influence here between building widening capacities, and then as you spread basic income more and more across the world, that might lead back into new tools and new training approaches. So it's not just a linear model. And the idea is then to turn this into a tool, which for now I've called Scale 3D. So supporting capacity for transformation in these 3 dimensions. And this is something I'd love to develop with all of you in the context of the Weaving Lab. I've already developed some prototypes, and some people like June and Adrian have been really supportive in co-developing this tool. And it remains to be tested in various contexts. I've had some prototypes, applying it in workshops where you can then have these 3 dimensions laid out and have people reflect on which capacities are strongly developed in their networks, which could they develop more. And I made also like a prototype of an online Excel version where you can then fill out each of those capacities or each of those impacts and rate it from 1 to 5, reflect on what has been working well, what have we been achieving, what could we do to increase our capacity, and so on. Yeah, so I'll leave it here for the inputs. And I'd love to hear any questions from your side that can lead us into a short discussion.
Tim, just to say, I think this is a super model. It's so accessible.